There are women who survive betrayal by weeping. There are women who survive it by screaming. And then there is Serena Ashcroft, who survived it by doing something far more dangerous. She went quiet. She went still. She went back to work. Her husband controlled billions in dirty money, a criminal empire that stretched across 12 countries, and the loyalty of men who killed without hesitation. What he never counted on was the one person who knew exactly where every dollar was hidden. The woman who helped him build it all. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay with me until the end of this story. Like this video and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. But the night Serena Ashcroft found out about the affair, she was standing in her own kitchen at 11:43 in the evening, holding a glass of Bordeaux she hadn't touched, staring at a text message that wasn't meant for her eyes. It wasn't even a romantic message. That was the thing that lodged somewhere behind her sternum, like a splinter she couldn't reach. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't desire. It was logistical. A time. An address. A single line that read, "Same suite, don't use the elevator." And below it, a name saved in her husband's phone, not as a contact, but as an emoji. A small white diamond, which should have meant nothing and meant everything. Serena set the wine glass down on the marble counter. She set it down carefully, the way she did everything carefully, the way she had trained herself to do everything carefully over 9 years of marriage to a man whose enemies disappeared without explanation. She didn't throw it. She didn't shatter it against the Sub-Zero refrigerator that cost more than most people's cars. She just set it down, and then she stood very still, and she breathed. The kitchen was enormous. Everything in the Ashcroft-Kang household was enormous. The penthouse on the 53rd floor of a tower in Manhattan's Upper West Side, the estate in the Hamptons, the villa outside Geneva that Kang Tae-hyun used for what he called European business meetings, and what Serena had long understood to be something else entirely. The kitchen had 2 islands. Serena had never understood why a kitchen needed 2 islands. She had asked once, early in the marriage, and Tae-hyun had looked at her with that particular expression of his, patient, faintly amused, the expression of a man who has already won the argument before it starts, and said, "Because we can." That had been his answer to a great many things. She picked up the phone again, turned it over. It was Tae-hyun's secondary device, the one he left on the charger in the kitchen overnight, the one she had never once touched in 9 years because she understood, implicitly, the way a person understands the rules of a house without being told, that some things in her husband's life were not meant for her. But he had been in Singapore for 4 days. He was due back tomorrow. And she had come downstairs for water, and the phone had buzzed on the counter, and she had glanced at the screen without meaning to, and the name, the white diamond, that stupid, careful, deliberate white diamond, had been right there. She scrolled up. She read for 11 minutes. Then she put the phone back exactly where she found it, with the screen facing down and the charging cable positioned the way it had been. She walked back upstairs. She got into their bed, the California King with the Belgian linen sheets that were changed every 3 days, and she lay on her back in the dark. And she stared at the ceiling, and she did not sleep for the rest of the night. But she did not cry either. That was important. That was, she would come to understand, the first decision she made. Kang Tae-hyun came home on a Tuesday afternoon looking like he always looked, like something assembled specifically to command a room. He was 44 years old and had the kind of face that aged with intention, sharp jaw, and careful eyes that were neither warm nor cold, but something more unsettling, something precise. He wore a charcoal suit that had been made for him in Seoul and a white shirt with no tie, and he walked through the door of the penthouse carrying nothing, because men like Tae-hyun did not carry their own bags. He had people for that. Serena met him in the foyer. She was wearing a cream-colored dress. Her hair was down. She had applied her makeup with the same attention she brought to everything, which meant it was flawless in a way that looked effortless. And she had thought about every detail of how she looked standing in that foyer because she had lain awake for 2 nights thinking about this moment and what it required of her. It required her to look exactly like herself. The self Tae-hyun expected. "You look tired," she said, and kissed him on the cheek. And his hands came up to her waist briefly, the gesture automatic, matrimonial, the muscle memory of 9 years. "Singapore is exhausting," he said. "The Lim brothers want restructuring on the Sentosa accounts. 3 meetings in 2 days." He moved past her toward the kitchen. "Is there food?" "Mrs. Park left something in the oven." "Good." He paused at the kitchen doorway, and for one moment, one fraction of a second, his eyes moved to the counter where his secondary phone sat on its charger. Just a glance, fast enough that a different woman might not have noticed. "Any calls while I was gone?" "Nothing urgent," Serena said. "Marcus Reeves called about the Meridian Gala. He needs a final count by Friday. Tell him 240. Taehyun opened the oven. "You look good." "Thank you," she said. She smiled at him. She had practiced the smile. Not in a mirror, she wasn't that theatrical, but internally, in the architecture of her own composure, building it the way she used to build financial models, layer by layer, stress-tested. A wife's smile, warm, a little tired, faintly glad he was home. She had been building smiles for 9 years, and she was very, very good at it. What she did not do, what she would not allow herself to do, was think about Arya Monroe. Not yet. Not here. Not in this kitchen, with this man eating food heated by a housekeeper, while somewhere in this city, a woman with a white diamond contact name was waiting for the next message on an encrypted phone. Not yet. Serena had been a forensic accountant before the marriage. Not a good one. Exceptional. By 31, she had been the youngest senior investigator at a boutique financial crimes firm in Chicago, and she had a reputation in certain federal circles for being the person you called when the numbers were supposed to not make sense. She had a gift for it that was almost physical, almost sensory. She could look at a set of accounts and feel where the lie was hiding, the way some people could hear a note that was slightly off pitch. It wasn't intuition exactly. It was pattern recognition built on 10,000 hours of sitting in windowless rooms staring at columns of figures until her eyes burned and the coffee went cold. She had met Taehyun at a conference in Hong Kong. He had been there as an investor, legitimately, or so she'd believed, representing a Seoul-based private equity firm with impeccable credentials and a portfolio of gleaming legitimate holdings. She had been there presenting a paper on emerging methodologies in cross-border financial crime detection. He had been in the audience. He had approached her afterward with 2 glasses of champagne and a question about her paper that demonstrated he had actually read it, which was already unusual enough to notice. She had been careful. She had run the basic checks. The firm checked out. His background checked out. He was charming in a way that was intelligent rather than performative, which she had always found more dangerous than the other kind, and he had pursued her with a patience and deliberateness that she found later was completely characteristic. She had not known. That was the thing she would spend years turning over like a stone in her pocket. She had not known. Not in the beginning. She was the person who found lies in numbers for a living, and she had not known. And this was the version that was harder to carry. She had known something. She had known something was not quite right, and she had chosen not to look too closely because she was in love, and because the life he was offering her was extraordinary, and because the woman who spent her days in windowless rooms with cold coffee was not entirely certain she deserved something extraordinary. And so when it arrived, she had accepted it with both hands and carefully. Carefully did not examine it too hard. That was the thing she could not say to anyone, not even to herself, for a long time. Chan. Arya Monroe was 29 years old and had, in the past 3 years, become one of the most recognizable names in American luxury fashion. Her label, Monroe Atelier, was the kind of thing that appeared in the style sections of publications that did not typically cover fashion, the kind of thing that got written about as a cultural moment rather than a brand. She had a face that photographed like a declaration. She had been on the cover of 4 major magazines in the past 18 months. She had been photographed at the Met Gala, at Cannes, at Art Basel, standing next to the kind of people whose names appeared in the same sentence as the word legacy. Serena had met her twice, once at a charity dinner, once at a gallery opening in Chelsea. Both times Arya had been charming, effortlessly poised, the kind of woman who made other women feel subtly underdressed. Both times Serena had come away with a vague, nagging impression she could not articulate. Something behind the performance, something calibrated. She had filed it away. She filed a great many things away. After the night with the phone, she stopped filing things away. She began opening the files instead. It started slowly. It had to start slowly. That was one of the first things Serena understood with cold clarity in those sleepless hours after she put Taehyun's phone back on the charger. Speed was vanity. Speed was how people got caught. Whatever she was going to do, and she did not yet know, fully what she was going to do, but she knew that something had fundamentally shifted in the architecture of her life, and that she could not simply go on living inside it. It had to be done with the patience she had once applied to financial crime investigations. Methodical, evidence first, emotion last, or better yet, emotion never. She started with what she already knew. What she already knew was not nothing. 9 years inside a marriage to a man like Tae-hyun, a marriage conducted in close proximity to his empire, a marriage where she had been permitted to see certain things because she was useful. Her background, her facility with numbers, her ability to move through elite social spaces with grace and credibility had given her a map. Not the whole map. She had understood intuitively that she was never meant to see the whole map. But she had pieces. More pieces than Tae-hyun realized she had, because he had underestimated her in the precise way that men like him underestimated women like her. He thought her loyalty was bought by comfort, that her intelligence had been domesticated by 9 years of luxury, that the woman who had once dismantled financial crimes for a living had been successfully converted into a decorative asset. He was wrong about that. She began in the study. Not Tae-hyun's study, her study, the smaller room off the master suite that she used for correspondence, and the charity work that occupied her official hours. In the third drawer of her desk was a laptop that she had purchased 18 months earlier with cash from an electronics store in Midtown that she had visited alone on a Tuesday afternoon while Tae-hyun was in a board meeting. She had bought it without connecting it to any home network, without creating an account linked to any of her existing identities. It sat in the drawer with the battery removed, and she had used it twice in 18 months, briefly, experimentally, to remind herself it was there. She took it out. She sat with it in her lap in the blue-gray dark of 3 in the morning, and she thought for a long time before she turned it on. She was making a choice. She understood that. This was not a choice she could walk back. She turned it on. Tae-hyun's financial architecture was, from the outside, extraordinary. That was the correct word. It was designed to inspire a particular kind of awe in the people permitted to see it, the sense that one was looking at something vast and legitimately accomplished, a monument to intelligence and ambition. Kang Capital International, the public face of his empire, operated across 14 countries and held legitimate positions in infrastructure, technology, real estate, and private equity. The public filings were immaculate. The audit trails were clean. The men who managed the legitimate side of the business were genuinely talented, genuinely credentialed, and genuinely had no idea, most of them, what they were sitting on top of. Serena had helped with some of that. Not the criminal infrastructure, she told herself this, and it was mostly true. But she had consulted over the years on certain structural questions, how to hold certain assets, how to create distance between entities. She had thought of it as tax efficiency. She had thought of it as the legal gray areas that every large multinational navigated as a matter of course. She had told herself this story for 9 years, and it had been mostly sufficient. The legitimate empire had roughly $11 billion in assets under management. The illegitimate one, she was beginning to understand, was considerably larger. She started with Monroe Atelier. The fashion label's financials were publicly available in the limited way that private companies' financials were publicly available. SEC filings related to its retail operations, real estate holdings tied to its flagship stores, the standard tax documents that could be obtained with patience and the right sources. Serena had those sources. She had maintained them quietly, peripherally, the way you keep a passport current even when you have no plans to travel, against the possibility of future necessity. What she found, working through the early morning hours while Tae-hyun slept 20 feet away, was a fashion company with an extraordinarily unusual revenue structure. Monroe Atelier's retail sales were strong enough to sustain a profitable luxury label, nothing more. Its operational costs were in line with comparable brands, but its cash flow told a different story. 3 times per year, large sums moved through a distribution subsidiary registered in Luxembourg, flowing outward to a network of small holding companies across Liechtenstein, Cyprus, and the Cayman Islands. Entities with no discoverable assets or operations, names that sounded like they had been generated by feeding a business name template to an algorithm. The outflows were not reported. The Luxembourg subsidiary existed at one remove from the parent company, connected through a layered ownership structure that would have been unremarkable to any casual examiner, and which to Serena looked within 40 minutes like an open hand held palm up. She had seen this before. Not this specific structure, It was more sophisticated than most she had encountered, but the logic of it, the shape of it. The fashion company was not primarily a fashion company, it was a conduit. The luxury brand was Cover, expensive, credible, high-volume Cover, the kind that moved a great deal of cash through what appeared to be retail operations without anyone asking uncomfortable questions about the difference between a handbag's cost of manufacture and its sale price. Her hands were cold. She noticed this the way she noticed things now, clinically, from a slight remove. She went looking for what was flowing in. The inflows were harder to trace. They were supposed to be. Whoever had designed the system, and Serena had a forming hypothesis about that, had constructed the intake side of the structure with considerably more care than the outflow side, which suggested to her that the priority had been obscuring the origin of the money rather than its destination, which was consistent with money laundering rather than simple embezzlement. The money was dirty going in. It was clean coming out. The fashion company was the middle mechanism. She found the first intake channel 3 weeks after she started looking. It came through a series of invoice payments from a legitimate-looking trading company registered in Singapore, a company called Meridian Pacific Holdings, which appeared to operate in commodities and had a clean surface record. The payments were for consulting services rendered at fees that bore no relationship to any plausible consulting engagement. The consulting invoices were a fig leaf that wouldn't survive 20 minutes of scrutiny. Meridian Pacific Holdings. She wrote that down. She recognized the name. She had heard it before in a context that had seemed routine at the time, a passing reference in a conversation at a dinner she had attended 6 months ago, a dinner at the Penthouse, one of Tae Hyun's regular gatherings of the men she thought of privately as the outer circle. The bankers, the lawyers, the politicians, the men who appeared in photographs with her husband and whose connection to the empire was sophisticated enough to maintain deniability. One of those men had mentioned Meridian in a conversation about Singapore tax structures, and Tae Hyun had steered the conversation elsewhere with the smooth efficiency of a man who steered conversations for a living, and Serena had filed it away. She opened the file. The Meridian thread took her somewhere she had not expected to go. She had expected the money to be moving narcotics profits or extortion revenues, the standard taxonomy of organized crime finance that she knew from her previous career. What she found, tracing the origin of the funds moving through Meridian, was something that stopped her breath in a different way, a colder way. Arms. Not in large quantities, not industrial scale, not state level, but consistent, documented by fragments of correspondence she found in a place she was not supposed to be looking. An encrypted server whose access credentials she had, because years ago she had helped to design the backup authentication system and had retained a copy of the master key in a place so unremarkable that no one had thought to revoke it. Small arms, directed through intermediaries toward conflict zones in West Africa and parts of Central Asia. Not enough to shift a war, enough to profit substantially from one. Serena sat with that for a long time. She had known her husband was not a legitimate businessman. She had known for years, known it with the wordless certainty of a person who is very intelligent and has chosen not to apply that intelligence to a particular question, that the empire had dimensions she was not meant to see. She had told herself a story in which organized crime meant gambling and protection and the kind of corruption that greased the wheels of the legitimate economy without, ultimately, killing anyone who wasn't already implicated. This was not that. She got up and went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists for a long time. Then she went back to the laptop and kept going. By the end of the 4th week, she had a clearer picture. Not complete. It was not complete and would never be complete from where she sat. But enough. The criminal enterprise operated in 4 primary verticals: narcotics distribution through a network of legitimate logistics companies in Southeast Asia and Europe, arms brokerage through Meridian and 2 related entities, extortion of legitimate businesses through a protection structure that Tae Hyun ran under the cover of security consulting, and money laundering, of which Monroe Atelier was the most elegant component but not the only one. The total scope, she estimated conservatively, was somewhere between $25 and $35 billion in annual revenue. Tae Hyun's legitimate empire was a footnote, a credibility mechanism, a frame around a much larger and far more brutal painting. She had helped build the frame. This was the thought she was not permitted to dwell on. Not if she was going to keep functioning. Not if she was going to complete what she had begun. She was not permitted to sit with the moral weight of the frame she had helped build. Not now. Later, she told herself. She would sit with it later. She would find a way to carry it. She focused on what she could control. She could control documentation. She could control evidence. She could control the path forward. The social calendar continued without interruption. This was, she came to understand, one of her most important assets. Tae-hyun's world ran on performance, on the continuous enactment of a certain kind of power, wealth, and respectability that required constant maintenance. Every gala, every dinner, every charity board meeting, every weekend in the Hamptons was both an obligation and an opportunity, and Serena had always been exceptional at these performances. She was the right kind of wife for a man like Tae-hyun, beautiful without being threatening, intelligent without being challenging, socially skilled in the way that created ease rather than envy. She continued to be that wife with terrifying precision. At the Meridian Gala, Marcus Reeves had his final count, 240. She wore a sapphire gown she had purchased specifically because it was the kind of thing that generated conversation, and she moved through 4 hours of cocktails and dinner and dancing in a state of remote, perfect composure, gathering information the way a landscape absorbs rain, everywhere, all at once, without visible effort. She talked to Congressman Darrell Walsh, who sat on a transportation subcommittee and who had, Serena now knew, received $240,000 from a Kang Capital subsidiary PAC over the past 3 election cycles. She was gracious and warm, and she filed away 3 things he said without appearing to listen to any of them. She talked to Helena Brooke, the general counsel of a Swiss private bank that appeared 3 times in the documentation Serena had been building, always as a payment facilitator, always at one remove from the actual transaction. Helena was 60, formidably intelligent, and had the specific energy of a woman who had spent decades being the only woman in rooms where important decisions were made and had made peace with that by becoming indispensable. Serena liked her, genuinely, which was uncomfortable. She filed it away. She talked to Aria Monroe. This was the moment Serena had prepared for most carefully. Aria was there with Tae-hyun's official blessing, introduced to the gala crowd as a Kang Capital portfolio investment. The fashion label was legitimate enough on its surface to sustain that framing, and she worked the room with an assurance that Serena recognized as hard-won rather than inherited. Whatever Aria was, and Serena was still assembling that answer, she was not a fool. They found each other near the bar during the period between dinner and dancing, which was the period when the event's social architecture loosened slightly and people said things they had not prepared. "Mrs. Kang," Aria said, and her smile was warm and exactly calibrated, and her eyes were careful. "Ms. Monroe, I've been meaning to tell you, the collection last month was extraordinary. The construction on that structured coat." Aria's smile shifted slightly, opened. This was the right thing to say, and Serena had known it would be, because she had spent 40 minutes reading a profile of Aria in a fashion publication specifically to find the right thing to say. "The construction killed us," Aria said. 3 fittings. My pattern cutter nearly quit. "Worth it. You can see where every decision was made." A pause, a sip of champagne. "Tae-hyun mentioned you're looking at expansion into the European market. Paris, maybe. Still early. The Luxembourg structure can complicate EU expansion, depending how the holding layers are organized." She said it lightly, conversationally, the way you might discuss traffic. And then she watched. Aria did not freeze. She was too controlled for that. But something moved across her face. Just a shadow, just a tremor of recalibration. And Serena saw it, and noted it, and smiled, and changed the subject. Later, in the car home, sitting beside Tae-hyun as Manhattan moved past the tinted windows, she thought about what she had seen in Aria's face. Not guilt, not quite. More like the specific alertness of a person who has just understood that they might be in a room with someone more dangerous than they realized. Serena looked out the window. She was more dangerous than Aria realized. She was increasingly more dangerous than Tae-hyun realized. She had just needed to remember that. The question of documentation was both technical and strategic, and Serena approached it with the same methodical care she brought to everything. She needed evidence that was sufficient, specific, and chain of custody defensible. She needed it stored in ways that could not be traced back to her active presence, could not be used as leverage against her, and could be delivered through channels that would guarantee its serious treatment rather than its burial. She had spent 12 years of her career understanding how evidence of financial crime was collected, preserved, and presented. She understood what prosecutors needed. She understood the difference between evidence that convicted and evidence that created plausible deniability. She understood that the most dangerous single point of failure in any financial crime investigation was the moment of exposure, the moment when the person holding the evidence moved from preparation to action, and she had built her planning around delaying that moment as long as possible. She began creating the documentation architecture in the 6th week. It was painstaking work, conducted in fragments, an hour here, 90 minutes there, always on the air-gapped laptop, never on a connected device, never in the penthouse when there was any possibility of being observed. She drove herself to a self-storage facility in Queens on a Saturday morning, ostensibly for the Hamptons estate furniture she had allegedly put in storage 18 months ago. In one of the units, she had established a physical documentation cache, printed records, encrypted drives, a filing system that would have been recognizable to any forensic investigator and completely opaque to anyone else. She copied ledgers. She copied correspondence. She built a network map, hand-drawn on paper, which she would photograph and destroy, of the major entities, their connections, and the key personnel at each node. She cross-referenced payment records against her knowledge of Tae-hyun's relationships, matching financial flows to people she had shaken hands with at galas, people she had sat next to at charity boards, people she had smiled at in the Hamptons. The network was larger than she had understood. It was also, she began to see, more fragile in certain specific places than its apparent scale suggested. The fragility was Tae-hyun himself. The empire had been built around a single center of gravity: his authority, his relationships, his direct control of the key financial channels. The underbosses were loyal because they were afraid and because they were profitable, not because the structure had genuine institutional depth. Take away Tae-hyun, and the center did not hold. The men below him would do what men in their position always did when the center collapsed. They would save themselves. She built her case around that fragility. She found the disappearance plan in the 9th week. It was not called the disappearance plan. It existed in fragments, in encrypted communications, in what appeared to be succession documents. In a series of asset transfers, she traced through 3 different offshore structures to a final destination in accounts she had never seen referenced before. Accounts held under names she did not recognize. Accounts that were being incrementally loaded with liquid assets in a pattern that was almost imperceptible over any short time window and unmistakable when viewed across 2 years. Tae-hyun was planning to vanish, not to be deposed, not to be arrested, not to lose. He was planning to disappear, to execute a controlled demolition of certain elements of the empire, sacrifice specific allies and enemies in a way that would redirect any investigative attention, and walk away with somewhere between $4 and $6 billion in liquid assets into a new identity that she found traces of. A passport, a backstory, an apartment in a city she had not immediately identified, buried in a transaction record that she had to read 3 times to be certain she understood. He was not planning to take her. She sat with this for a long time. Longer than she had sat with the arms trafficking, longer than she had sat with the affair, longer than she had sat with any of the other revelations that had accumulated over the past weeks. Because this one was different. This one was not about criminality or infidelity. This one was about the specific, considered, deliberate intention to leave her behind, to let her be the one holding the framework when it collapsed, to make her the face of the empire while he became someone else entirely. She was not in the disappearance plan. She was in the exposure plan. She was the part that got sacrificed. She closed the laptop very slowly. She sat in the dark storage unit with the smell of dust and paper around her, and she breathed carefully for a long time. Then she opened the laptop again. She had more work to do. By the 11th week, she had 4 encrypted drives, each containing a complete copy of the documentation she had assembled, each stored in a separate location across 3 states. She had secured a legal consultation conducted under a false name at a firm she had researched and chosen specifically for its track record in organized crime prosecution cases, and she had come away from that consultation with a clear understanding of what she needed and how to structure its delivery. She had opened accounts under her new identity, the identity she had begun constructing 6 months before any of this, from a habit of preparation that she now understood had been some deeper part of herself already reaching for an exit. She had contacted, through an anonymized channel, 3 journalists. One at a national daily with a track record of organized crime coverage, one at a financial publication with the technical capacity to analyze what she would be sending, and one international correspondent based in Brussels, whose recent work on arms trafficking financing had demonstrated both competence and courage. She had not identified herself. She had not sent anything. She had only made contact, established the channel, let them know that documentation was coming and that it would be significant. She had arranged for the simultaneous delivery to be managed automatically, a dead man's switch architecture, essentially, designed so that the evidence would release at a specified time unless she actively prevented it. This meant that her own physical safety was, paradoxically, tied to the continued functioning of the system. Any attempt to eliminate her before the release would only accelerate it. She thought Tae-hyun was smart enough to understand this, if he found out before she was ready. If it came to that, she hoped it would not come to that. She had one more thing to do before the release, one thing that she understood was not strictly necessary. The case was built without it, but that she needed to do for reasons she could not entirely articulate even to herself. Not revenge, not theater. Something else. Something that had to do with being seen, with being present, in the room, when certain things were said. She needed to talk to him. She needed to talk to both of them. She had found the address of the penthouse from a transaction record. Tae-hyun maintained it under a shell company, completely separate from any shared marital asset. The kind of discretion that had seemed once like evidence of care for her feelings, and now seemed like evidence of an exit plan that had existed for a very long time. She had driven past it twice, noting the entrance, the elevator situation, the security setup. It was on a Tuesday that she finally went inside. She was wearing a gray suit. Her hair was up. She was carrying nothing except her phone, which was powered off and in her pocket. She had taken the stairs. Don't use the elevator, she remembered. And she stood outside the door for perhaps 10 seconds before she knocked. Tae-hyun opened it. The expression on his face moved through several distinct phases in rapid succession. Surprise, calculation, a flash of something that might have been fear, and then the settling into the particular stillness he used when he needed to assess a situation. Behind him, across the open-plan living space, Arya stood near the window in a silk robe, and her face had gone very careful, very still, and her eyes moved between Serena and Tae-hyun with the specific alertness of a person running threat assessment. Serena smiled. It was the easiest smile she had produced in 11 weeks, because she no longer needed to make it warm. "We should talk," she said. "All three of us." Tae-hyun did not move. He was blocking the doorway the way men block doorways when they are deciding whether to let something in, and his eyes were doing the precise, rapid calculation that had always been his particular genius. She could almost see it, the variables, the angles, what she knew, what she might know, what he could say to contain this. "Serena, I've read the Luxembourg files," she said. "I've read the Meridian files. I've read the accounts you've been building for the past 2 years under the names I don't recognize." She paused. "I've read your exit plan, Tae-hyun." The stillness that moved through him was different from his normal stillness. This one had something underneath it. Behind him, Arya took a step toward the interior of the room, and Serena shifted her gaze to her for just a moment. "You should probably sit down too," she said to Arya, "because what I'm about to tell you concerns you almost as much as it concerns him, and you are going to want to know that you've been considerably less important to this situation than you believed." The door opened wider. Tae-hyun stepped back, almost involuntarily, as though the force of what she had just said had physically displaced him, and Serena Ashcroft walked into the room. She had 11 weeks of evidence and a dead man's switch, and a new identity waiting for her in another country. She had the only leverage that could exist in a room like this, with a man like this. And she had not yet decided, not entirely, not finally, whether she was going to give him a chance to respond. The penthouse smelled like money and fresh flowers, and something underneath both of those things that Serena could not immediately name and then could: anxiety. The specific chemical signature of two people who had been caught and were processing what that meant. Tae-hyun moved to the center of the living room and stopped. He did not sit. Men like him did not sit in rooms where they felt cornered. Sitting was a concession, a lowering, and he was not ready to lower himself yet. He was still in the assessment phase, still running numbers, still trying to find the angle that returned him to the position of control. Serena recognized the process. She had watched it for 9 years, and she understood it the way you understood the weather patterns in a place you had lived long enough. Arya had moved to the far end of the couch. She was sitting, but barely, perched, her weight forward, both feet flat on the floor. The silk robe was elegant even in distress, which was probably a professional reflex. She had poured herself a glass of water from the carafe on the coffee table and was holding it without drinking from it, and her eyes had not left Serena since Serena walked through the door. Serena stood just inside the room. She did not move to sit down. She did not move toward either of them. She stood where she was, in the gray suit, with her hands loose at her sides, and she let the silence do its work for a moment because silence in a room like this was its own kind of pressure. "The exit plan," Tae-hyun said finally. His voice was even. Whatever was happening behind his eyes, his voice was even. "Tell me what you think you read." "I don't think I read it," she said. "I read it. You accessed encrypted systems." "Yes." "Systems that are—" He stopped. A brief recalibration. "How long?" 11 weeks. Something moved through him at that. Not fear exactly. More like the specific sensation of a man who has just measured a distance and found it considerably greater than he believed. 11 weeks, he repeated. The Luxembourg files were the starting point, Monroe Atelier's cash flow structure. She let her gaze move briefly to Arya, deliberately, watching what happened in Arya's face when she heard her own company named in this context. From there, it was straightforward. The Meridian thread took longer, 3 weeks approximately. The exit accounts took another 2 weeks to trace, because the naming convention was careful, but the transfer timing had a pattern. You transferred on the 14th of each month. That was consistent enough to identify across 2 years of data. Tae-hyun was very still. "I want to know," he said, "what you intend to do." "I'm going to tell you what I've found," she said. "Both of you. And then I'm going to leave. And then you're going to understand something important about your situation." Arya set down the water glass. The sound it made on the table was small and precise. "You said I've been less important to this than I believed." Her voice was careful, controlled. She was, Serena thought, considerably more composed than most people would have been in her position, which was either character or calculation or both. "What does that mean?" "It means," Serena said, "that the affair is not the point. The affair is—" She paused, choosing the word, "a management technique. You move money through Monroe Atelier. Tae-hyun manages you through the relationship. When the exit plan executes, the fashion label becomes the most visible and most traceable component of a structure that he will not be anywhere near. You will be." She looked at Arya steadily. "You will be the face on the prosecution's Exhibit A." Arya looked at Tae-hyun. Tae-hyun did not look back at her. That was the moment, Serena thought. That was the moment when Arya Monroe understood something she should have understood much earlier, and the understanding was crossing her face with a clarity that was almost painful to observe. Not because Serena felt sympathy exactly, but because she recognized it. The specific sensation of having been used by someone you trusted. "That's a lie," Arya said. "But it came out wrong, too considered, too flat. The Luxembourg subsidiary shows 18 months of outflows to entities in Liechtenstein, Cyprus, and the Cayman Islands," Serena said. "The intake side moves through Meridian Pacific Holdings in Singapore, which I can connect through 3 intermediaries to arms brokerage accounts. I have the documentation. I have the bank records. I have 2 years of encrypted correspondence." She looked at Tae-hyun. "Your name appears 463 times in the communications I've recovered. Hers appears 92 times. All of them are operational." The room was very quiet. "You've been building a case," Tae-hyun said. It was not a question. "Yes. Against me. Against the enterprise." He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way he had not looked at her in years, she thought, in the way that you look at something when you are finally seeing it accurately rather than seeing the version of it you have decided to see. She held the look without difficulty. She had prepared for this too. "You have a delivery mechanism," he said. "Yes." "Automated." "Yes." He absorbed this. The thing that crossed his face was complex. There was anger in it, but it was the cold, structural kind, not the hot kind. And beneath the anger, there was something that she recognized with a distant, careful surprise as a kind of respect. Not warm, not generous. The involuntary respect of a strategist encountering another strategist. "When?" he said. "That depends," she said, "on what happens next." What happened next was not a negotiation exactly, because a negotiation required both parties to have something the other wanted, and the asymmetry of what she had built made that impossible. What it was a conversation that lasted 45 minutes in that penthouse living room, during which the three of them moved around each other with the careful, loaded attention of people in a room where something irreversible was about to happen, and all of them could feel the edge of it. Taehyun tried several approaches. He was good at this. He had spent decades navigating rooms where the balance of power was contested, and he had a toolbox that was extensive and well-maintained. The first approach was minimization. The enterprise was not what she thought it was. The documentation was partial. The conclusions she had drawn were... He stopped when he saw her face. She was not afraid of his minimization. That was clear, and he read it clearly. The second approach was framing. Whatever had happened, she was a part of it. She had benefited from it. She had, in specific ways, contributed to specific structures. Whatever she thought she was holding over him, she was holding it over herself as well. "I know," she said. "I've accounted for that." He paused. "Have you?" My legal consultation confirmed that my exposure is limited to 2 specific advisory engagements I was directly involved in, both of which I can contextualize credibly as unknowing participation in structures whose purpose was concealed from me. She paused. "I have a forensic accountant's professional record as an investigator of financial crime. I'm going to need that record to mean something. I've been careful about what I've touched and what I haven't." "For 9 years," he said flatly. "Not for 9 years," she said. "For 11 weeks. I was very careful for 11 weeks. Before that, I was your wife." Something shifted in his expression that she did not entirely recognize and did not try to. She was not here to understand his feelings. She was here to complete what she came to do. The third approach, and this was the one that required the most careful handling, was personal. He moved away from the central axis of the room, moved toward her in a way that reduced the physical distance between them. And when he spoke, his voice had changed register, gone quieter, gone to the place she recognized from early in the marriage, the voice he used when he was being or performing intimacy. "Serena." Just her name, just the 2 syllables. "Don't," she said, "we can..." "Don't." The word was flat and final, and he heard it because he had always been, whatever else he was, a man who understood when a door had closed. He stopped. He looked at her for a long moment from that reduced distance, close enough that she could see the precise working of his jaw, the way his breathing had shifted, the controlled effort of a man holding himself very still against what his instincts were telling him to do. She did not know what his instincts were telling him, and she did not want to find out. She stepped back, reestablished the distance. "I'm leaving now," she said. "You have what you need to understand your situation. I would recommend against any action that would trigger the delivery mechanism. I would recommend against attempting to locate the documentation, because it exists in multiple locations, and any interference with one location accelerates the release from others." She looked at him steadily. "I would recommend against anything that resembles a threat." "I haven't threatened you," he said. "No," she said. "You haven't." That was the correct choice. She looked at Arya one more time. Arya was sitting very still, the water glass back in her hands, her face a careful composition that had some distance of shock behind it. Not the theatrical kind, the metabolic kind, the kind that happens when the architecture of your understanding has just been fundamentally revised. She looked younger than she did at galas. More real, somehow. "For what it's worth," Serena said to her, "I think you're good at what you do. The collection was genuinely exceptional." She paused. "You should find a different investor." Then she walked to the door, and she opened it, and she walked out, and she took the stairs down, and she walked through the lobby and out into the midday street, and she did not look back. She sat in her car, parked 2 blocks away, a rental she had paid for in cash, for 22 minutes without starting the engine. The adrenaline was moving through her system in a way that felt almost tidal, a slow, heavy wave she had to breathe against. Her hands on the wheel were steady. She checked this deliberately, looked at them, confirmed they were steady. They were. She had not planned to tell him that much. She had planned to be more oblique, more strategic, give him the shape of what she had without the specifics, maintain uncertainty about the precise scope. But in the room, with his eyes on her, and 11 weeks of what she had learned pressing against the inside of her chest, she had told him clearly and directly. And she was not sure yet whether that had been a mistake or a necessary thing. She thought it was necessary. She thought he had needed to know that she had seen the exit plan, that she had seen what she was supposed to be, the thing left behind, the face on the prosecution board, the wife who would be handed to investigators as a goodwill gesture by a man who was already someone else in another country. He needed to know that she had seen that. She needed him to know that she had seen it. She started the car. The next 72 hours moved at two different speeds. On the surface, at the penthouse, at the charity board meeting she attended on Wednesday, at the dinner she had with two of Tae-hyun's legitimate business associates on Thursday evening. Everything moved at the normal speed of her life, which was the speed of controlled performance, unhurried and precise. Tae-hyun came home on Tuesday night. He was quiet in the way that he was quiet when he was working through a problem, and she was quiet too. And they moved through the apartment in the specific parallel silence of two people who are cohabitating a situation they are not yet discussing. He did not touch her. He did not raise his voice. He did not, as far as she could determine, make any move against the documentation. No attempt to reach the storage unit in Queens. No contact with the lawyers she had been careful to keep out of the evidence chain. No communication through the channels she was monitoring. He was, she thought, still in the assessment phase, still running the variables, still trying to find the angle. Underneath the surface, everything moved very fast. She received, through the anonymized channel she had established with the Brussels correspondent, a response that told her the journalist had reviewed the preliminary materials she had forwarded and was, as the message put it, highly interested in proceeding. The financial publication had responded similarly. The domestic journalist, the one at the National Daily, the one with the organized crime track record, had not yet responded, and the silence was making her cautious. On Wednesday afternoon, she drove to Queens. She confirmed the storage unit was undisturbed. She moved one of the 4 encrypted drives to a new location, a safety deposit box at a bank in the Bronx held under her constructed identity, because she had learned from the monitoring she was conducting on Tae-hyun's communications through the server access she still had, that he had made contact with a man she knew by reputation as someone who found things that were not meant to be found. His name was Decker. He had no last name in any database she could access. He had a reputation in Tae-hyun's world as the person you engaged when something needed to be located and retrieved, and the speed with which Tae-hyun had engaged him, within 36 hours of the penthouse conversation, told her that the assessment phase was over and Tae-hyun had moved to the containment phase. She had anticipated this. She had not anticipated how quickly it would happen, which was information in itself. It told her that what she had said in the penthouse had frightened him more than she had calculated. A man who moved this fast was a man whose primary emotion, underneath the calculation, was fear. Good. She was frightened too. She would not have been honest with herself if she denied it. The presence of Decker in the situation was a variable she had accounted for in theory and was now encountering in practice, and the practice of it was different from the theory. Colder, more physical, more immediate. She drove differently now. She took different routes. She was more careful about the windows, but she did not stop. On Thursday evening at the dinner with Tae-hyun's business associates, 2 men named Halverson and Park Sung-jin, respectively the CFO of the legitimate investment arm and a senior partner at the law firm that handled Kang Capital's international compliance, Serena noticed something she had not noticed before, or rather noticed it in a new way. Halverson was nervous. Not about her. He didn't know about her. She was almost certain of that. He was too far removed from the actual machinery of the enterprise. He was nervous about something else, something that had entered his awareness recently, and the nervousness manifested in the specific way that financial professionals' nervousness manifested, in a slight over-precision of language, in a tendency to pause before answering certain questions, in the kind of careful blankness that overtook a face when a subject drifted close to something uncomfortable. After the main course, while Park Sung-jin was in the bathroom and Tae-hyun had stepped away to take a call, Serena set down her fork and said to Halverson very quietly, "You know something's wrong." He looked at her. His expression did not change. While he was a CFO, expression management was a job requirement, but something behind his eyes did. "I don't know what you know what. You've been auditing the subsidiary accounts," she said. "The ones in Luxembourg. You found an irregularity and you flagged it internally and nothing happened, and now you're sitting at this table wondering whether to flag it somewhere else." The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long, which was, in the context of a conversation like this, a very long silence. "I have a fiduciary responsibility," he said carefully. "Yes," she said, "you do." She picked her fork back up. I'd honor it sooner rather than later if I were you. The window for acting from a position of good faith is going to close. Taehyun came back to the table. Halverson straightened. The conversation moved back to legitimate territory and stayed there for the rest of the evening, and Serena ate her dinner and smiled at the appropriate moments and said nothing further that was out of the ordinary. But she had watched Halverson's face when Taehyun sat back down, watched the small, involuntary recalibration of a man who was beginning to sort the people at his table into two categories, the ones he was in danger from and the ones he was not. She was planting seeds. She had more seeds to plant. Friday morning, 6 days after the penthouse meeting, Taehyun came into the kitchen while she was making coffee, and he sat down at the island, the second island, the one she had never understood the purpose of, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I want to make an offer." She poured 2 cups, slid one across to him. "I'm listening. The exit plan, the accounts, they're larger than you think." He wrapped his hands around the cup. His hands were, as always, very steady. "There's enough to, if the structure were revised, for 2 exits, not 1. She looked at him. "You and I," he said, "different identities, different locations, but the same magnitude, 4 to 5 billion each." He paused. "The case you've built, it disappears. The drives are destroyed, the channels are closed, and we both walk away from this." The kitchen was quiet. The city was outside the window, 53 floors below, moving at its own speed. "And the enterprise," she said, "the logistics companies, the Meridian Arms Network, the narcotics distribution, continues without us. That's not our—" "Continues," she said, "without any of the exposure that the evidence I've built would create." She looked at him steadily. "Without the investigations, without the prosecutions, without any consequence for any of it." He met her gaze. "Yes." She picked up her coffee cup. She drank from it slowly, looking out the window at the city below. "No," she said. Something moved in his expression that she had not seen before, but not rage, not calculation, but something rawer than those, something that came from a place in him that did not usually have permission to show. "Serena, that's my answer," she said. She set the cup down. "That was always going to be my answer. I think you knew that. I think that's why the exit plan didn't include me." She paused. "You knew I wouldn't leave people behind to take the weight of this. You knew that before I did." He was quiet for a long time. "Then there's nothing to discuss," he said finally. "No," she said. "There isn't." He stood up. He picked up his coffee cup and carried it toward the sink, and she watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the particular carriage of a man who had just understood that something he had built, not the empire, something more intimate than the empire, had ended in a way that was not recoverable. At the sink he stopped. "Decker is good at what he does," he said, without turning around. Her breathing didn't change. She had promised herself it wouldn't change. "I know," she said. "If he finds one of the drives—" "He won't find all of them," she said. "And the system doesn't require all of them. It only requires me to not prevent it." She paused. "You understand the logic." He turned around then. He looked at her across the kitchen. The enormous kitchen, with its 2 islands, in the apartment on the 53rd floor of a building that the criminal empire had paid for. And his face had the expression of a man who was performing a final calculation and arriving at an answer he did not want. 8 days, she said. "That's how long you have before the first package releases. I want you to use those 8 days to consider turning yourself in. I want you to know that any cooperation with federal authorities, any genuine cooperation, will be acknowledged in my evidence submission as a mitigating factor." She held his gaze. "That's the only offer I'm making." He set the coffee cup down in the sink. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the kitchen doorway, and he stopped there, and he said without looking at her, "I built everything in this apartment, everything in this city, everything that has your name on it." "I know," she said, "and you're going to burn it," Taehyun said. He did not wait for her answer. He walked out of the kitchen, and she heard his footsteps cross the foyer, and then she heard the front door open and close with a precision that was, characteristically, not a slam. He did not slam doors. He had never slammed a door in 9 years of marriage. He closed things with a finality that was worse than slamming, the finality of a man who had decided. Serena stood in the kitchen for a long moment after he left. The coffee was cooling in her cup. The city was still outside the window, still moving at its own indifferent speed, and she was standing in an enormous kitchen with two islands, and she was thinking about the word he had used, burn. She had not thought of it that way. She had thought of it as exposure, as documentation, as the application of due process to a set of facts that demanded it. She had been very careful, in her own internal language, not to use words like burn or destroy, because those words carried an emotional valence she could not afford. But he had said it, and it had landed somewhere real, and she stood with it for the time it took to finish her coffee. And then she rinsed the cup and set it in the rack, and she went to prepare for the day. She had 6 days left. 7. The first sign that something was wrong came on Saturday afternoon. She was in the study, her study, the one with the laptop in the drawer, when her phone rang. Not her primary phone, which was on the desk beside her, her secondary phone. The burner she had purchased in cash and used exclusively for the anonymized communications with the 3 journalists. It rang, which it should not have done, because she had given that number to no one except the 3 journalists through a channel that was supposed to be unidirectional. They responded through a separate secure messaging application. The number should not have rung. She picked it up. The voice on the other end was a man's. She did not recognize it. It was calm and unhurried, the kind of calm that was professional rather than natural. And it said, "Ms. Ashcroft, I think we should discuss the drives." She hung up immediately. She sat very still for approximately 3 seconds. Then she picked up the burner phone and removed the battery and the SIM card and put both in separate pockets. She closed the laptop. She stood up and she breathed, and she thought with the cold, rapid precision she had been training for 11 weeks. The number was burned. That was the first implication. Someone, Decker, or someone working with Decker, had compromised the burner number, which meant they had access either to the channel she had used to contact the journalists or to one of the journalists themselves. The channel was encrypted and had been established through a series of steps she had believed were sound. If the channel was compromised, the question was when, before or after she had sent the preliminary materials to the Brussels correspondent. If before, the materials were potentially in Taehyun's hands. If after, they were not, but her contact at the publication was. She needed to know which. She needed to know, and she had no clean way to find out because every channel she had been using had just been flagged as potentially compromised. And the only people who could tell her what had happened were the journalists themselves, whom she could not now safely contact. She walked to the window and looked out at the city and did not allow herself to panic. Panic was a biological event, involuntary, but the response to panic was not involuntary. The response was a choice, and she chose very deliberately to stand at the window and breathe until the adrenaline wave crested and began to recede. And then she began to think. She left the penthouse an hour later on the pretext of a hair appointment that she had, in fact, scheduled 3 weeks earlier precisely to give herself a legitimate reason to be out of the apartment on a Saturday afternoon. She did not go to the hair appointment. She walked 6 blocks north and then descended to the subway and took 2 trains in directions that served no geographical purpose and got off at a station in Lower Manhattan and walked to a payphone, one of the surviving ones, the ones that the city maintained in certain neighborhoods as vestigial infrastructure, and called a number she had memorized rather than stored. The number belonged to the domestic journalist, the one at the National Daily, the one who had not responded to her initial contact. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She hung up. She tried the Brussels number. Voicemail. The financial publication contact picked up on the second ring, and before she could speak, the voice, a woman's, someone she had spoken with once before through the secure channel, said, very quickly and very quietly, "Don't say your name. Listen to me. The Brussels contact has been approached. We don't know by whom. He hasn't confirmed whether he shared anything. I received a call this morning from a number I don't recognize asking about the source of the preliminary materials. I didn't say anything, but you need to know that the chain has been touched." Serena pressed the phone against her ear and kept her face entirely neutral because she was on a public street and there were people around her, and keeping her face neutral was the most important thing she could do right now. "The materials themselves," she said. "The preliminary package. I have them, secured. But if the Brussels contact shared his copy..." "He received a different version of the package," Serena said. This was true. She had been careful to send different versions to each journalist with minor structural variations that would allow her to identify which copy had leaked if it came to that. "What was in his version will be identifiable." A brief silence. Okay. That's useful." A pause. "Are you safe?" "Currently," Serena said, I need 48 hours. Can you hold what you have for 48 hours? Yes. But after that, the domestic journalist still hasn't responded to anything. I know. Don't contact him again. She paused. And thank you. She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk in Lower Manhattan with her hands in her coat pockets and the wind off the water moving through the street, and she thought about what she had just learned and what it meant. The chain had been touched. That was the phrase. Clinical, accurate, and utterly inadequate to the reality of what it described. Someone in the journalism network had been found, which meant that Decker, or whoever was working this problem for Tae Hyun, was further along than she had calculated. She had estimated, based on the complexity of tracing the burner channel, that she had several more days of operational security. She had been wrong by a significant margin. She began walking. She walked without a destination for 3 blocks, because walking helped her think, and then she had a destination, and she walked toward it. The self-storage facility in Queens was a 40-minute drive that she made in 60 minutes, varying her route twice and stopping once to confirm she was not being followed. She was almost certain she was not being followed. Almost certain was not the standard she preferred, but it was the standard she had. She used her key and her access code and walked to the unit, and she saw, before she reached it, that the door was sitting a half-inch ajar. She stopped. The unit should have been locked. She had locked it herself 6 days ago when she moved the 4th drive to the Bronx safety deposit box. She stood in the corridor of the facility with its fluorescent lights and its smell of old cardboard, and she looked at the half-inch gap, and she stayed very still and breathed and thought. She approached slowly. She pushed the door open. The unit had been searched, not ransacked. This was not the work of someone who wanted her to know she had been found. This was the work of someone professional, someone careful, someone who had moved through the space with the specific discipline of not leaving a signature. But she knew the unit. She had organized it herself. She knew where things were, what was stacked how, what order the files were in, and she could see, in the careful, not quite rightness of the space, that everything had been examined and returned to an approximation of its original position. The first drive was gone. She had known it would be. The first drive, stored in a waterproof box inside a folded blanket in the back corner, it was gone. The box was there. The blanket was there, refolded, almost correctly. The drive was not. She stood in the storage unit for a long time. The thing she was experiencing was not panic and was not despair exactly. It was something more disorienting than either, something that had the quality of vertigo, the sudden loss of the stable ground she had been standing on for 11 weeks. She had built this architecture carefully. She had stress-tested it in her mind 100 times. And it was being dismantled faster than she had believed possible. 1 drive gone. 3 remaining. The system only required 1 to function. She had built it that way, specifically against this possibility. But the speed of it. The speed was wrong. This was not someone working through the logic of her system from the outside. This was someone who knew the system. This was someone who had been told about the system. She left the storage unit. She locked it behind her. Force of habit, pointless now. And she walked to her car, and she sat in it, and she held the thought she had just had at a slight distance, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, because she did not want it to be true, and needing to not want it was not the same as needing it to not be true. Someone had been told about the system. There were 3 people who knew the outline of the documentation architecture, outside of herself. The 3 journalists. She had told each of them, in limited terms, that the evidence was distributed and would release automatically. She had not told any of them the specific locations. She had not told them about the dead man's switch mechanism in detail. But she had told the Brussels contact, in their second exchange, when he had asked about source protection, that the materials existed in physical form in secured locations in the United States. Physical form. Secured locations. He had been approached. He had been approached, and she did not know what he had said. She started the car. She found out what he had said 43 minutes later, in a parking garage in Midtown, sitting in the car with her secondary phone reconstructed and a text message on the secure application that read, Brussels confirmed approach. They had his family, wife and daughter in Ghent. He gave them the outline. Not locations, but structure. Distributed physical storage. Automated release mechanism. US-based. I'm sorry. He didn't know the specifics, but they know the shape. They had his family. She read that twice. The The weight of it was a different kind of weight than anything else she had encountered in 11 weeks. Not the weight of evidence or strategy, but the weight of consequence. The weight of what her actions had brought into contact with the life of a man in Brussels who had a wife and a daughter. And she sat with that weight for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was not long, and then she set it down in the part of herself where she was storing things to carry later, and she thought about what they know the shape meant in practical terms. They knew it was distributed. They knew it was automated. They knew she was the active component, that she had to be present and functional for the release to not happen, and she had to actively intervene to prevent it, which meant that removing her from the situation was not a clean solution from Tae-hyun's perspective, and Decker would have told him that, which meant that removal was probably not the immediate play. The immediate play was the drives. Find them all. Destroy them. Eliminate the physical evidence before the release date. Eliminate the automation mechanism if they could find it, which they couldn't, because the automation existed on a server she had built access to through a chain of proxies that she was reasonably confident was still clean. Reasonably confident. That phrase again. She had 6 days. She had 3 drives. She had one journalist who was still holding the preliminary package. She had a dead man's switch that required her to actively prevent the release, which meant that what Tae-hyun and Decker would be focused on was not killing her, but controlling her, finding her, containing her, creating a situation in which she would choose to prevent the release herself. They needed leverage over her the way she had leverage over them. She thought about what leverage over her would look like. She thought about the people in her life, the real ones, the ones that existed outside the performance of her marriage. Her sister Claire, who lived in Portland and who Serena had been careful over the past 3 months to keep entirely uninvolved. Her former colleague at the Chicago firm, Daniel Park, who knew nothing. Her mother, retired in Scottsdale. None of them knew anything. She had been scrupulous about that. But scrupulous was not the same as invulnerable, and a man like Decker did not need someone to know something in order to use them. He needed them to be findable. He needed her to have something to lose. Her phone rang. The reconstructed burner. The same number as before. She picked it up. "You found the storage unit," the man said. Same calm, same professional unhurriedness. "Yes," she said. "We have the drive. We're looking for the others." A pause. "We're also looking at Portland." Her jaw tightened. She controlled it. "My sister has nothing to do with this. She doesn't need to." The voice was neither threatening nor warm. It was simply informational, the voice of someone communicating facts. "Mr. Kang would like to resolve this before the release date. He's willing to be generous." "He already made me an offer," she said. "I declined. That offer is no longer available." A brief pause. "The current offer is simpler. You provide the locations of the remaining drives and the mechanism for preventing the automated release. In exchange, Mr. Kang guarantees your safety and your family's safety, and provides documentation establishing your full cooperation with any subsequent legal proceedings as having been coerced. You walk away without prosecution risk." Another pause. "You also walk away without $4 billion, but you walk away." She looked through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking garage. "I need time to consider," she said. "You have until midnight tonight," the man said, and disconnected. Chad. She drove to the Bronx. She needed to confirm that the safety deposit box was intact. The 4th drive. The one she had moved 6 days ago. The one that Decker did not yet know about because she had moved it after the storage unit was established and had told no one about the relocation. She parked 3 blocks from the bank and walked the rest of the way and spent 7 minutes inside and came back out with the drive in her coat pocket and a clarity that was cold and complete. The drive was intact. She had one drive physically in her possession. She had the automated release still functioning. She had the financial publication journalist still holding the preliminary package. What she did not have was time. She did not have 6 days anymore. She had hours because Decker was in the storage unit by now, or had been, and he would find evidence of the 4th drive's existence even if he couldn't find the drive itself. She had not been careful enough about that in the early weeks, before she knew how fast this would move, and there would be something in the unit that pointed toward a 4th cache. She needed to accelerate the release. Not 8 days. Not midnight tonight. She needed to move. She walked back to the car. She sat in the driver's seat and she laid the drive on the passenger seat and she looked at it and she thought about the Brussels journalist and his wife and his daughter in Ghent, And she thought about Claire in Portland, and she thought about the weight she was carrying in the part of herself where she was storing things for later. And she understood, with a finality that was entirely different from any of the other finalities she had encountered, that the person she needed to be right now was not the woman who had spent 9 years inside a marriage to Kang Tae-hyun. It was not even the forensic accountant she had been before. The person she needed to be was someone who could look at the cost of what she was doing, the real cost, the human cost, the Brussels journalist's daughter, the way the weight accumulated, and continue anyway. Not because the cost didn't matter, because the alternative was to let the cost of stopping matter more than the cost of continuing. And she had seen the Meridian files, and she had seen what moved through those logistics channels in West Africa. And she knew that the weight she was carrying was not the heaviest weight in this equation. It was not close. She picked up the drive. She put it in her inside coat pocket against her chest where she could feel it. She needed one more thing before she moved. She needed to know whether the domestic journalist, the one who had never responded, the one at the National Daily, was compromised or simply cautious. Because if he was compromised, then the evidence package she had prepared for him was in Tae-hyun's hands, and that changed the calculation in ways she needed to account for. She had one way to find out. It required her to surface in a way she had been avoiding. It required her to make direct contact with someone who could reach him. A mutual professional connection from her Chicago years. A woman named Sandra Voss, who had left financial crime investigation to become an editor at a major legal publication, and who had no knowledge of what Serena had been building, but who knew the domestic journalist personally, had worked with him, and whom Serena could call from a payphone under the cover of a professional inquiry without raising a flag that would be visible to Decker. She found a payphone 4 blocks away. Sandra Voss picked up on the 3rd ring. "Sandra, it's Serena Ashcroft. I know it's been a long time." A brief, surprised pause. "Serena, God, yes, it has been." A warm settling into the conversation. "How are you?" "I'm well. I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I'm working on something. Very preliminary. Nothing I can discuss yet. And I need to find someone at the national level with organized crime background. I had someone recommend Marcus Hale. Do you know him?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds long, and in those 3 seconds Serena knew, with the pattern recognition certainty that had always been her particular gift, that something was wrong. "Marcus Hale," Sandra said carefully. "He was—" "Serena, Marcus Hale died 4 days ago. It was reported as a heart attack," Sandra said. "But Marcus was 51 and ran half marathons. Nobody who knew him believed it." Serena's hand tightened on the payphone receiver until the plastic edge cut into her palm. She registered the pain distantly, from the same remove she had been using to register everything today. And she said very steadily, "When exactly?" 4 days ago, Tuesday morning, they found him in his car outside his apartment in Brooklyn. Sandra's voice had dropped, the warm professional register replaced by something quieter and more careful. "Serena, why are you asking about Marcus specifically?" "Professional inquiry," she said. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Thank you, Sandra." She hung up. She stood at the payphone with her hand still on the receiver and the city noise around her. Traffic, a distant siren, someone's music from an open window above. And she ran the arithmetic with the cold mechanical part of her brain that was still functioning while the rest of her absorbed what she had just learned. Marcus Hale had been the domestic journalist. He had been her 3rd channel. He had not failed to respond to her initial contact because he was cautious. He had not responded because he was already dead before she made contact, or had been killed immediately after, which meant her initial outreach had been the event that marked him. Which meant the channel she had used to reach him had been surveilled before she used it, before the 11 weeks, possibly before she even began, which meant someone had known she was looking before she knew she was looking. The payphone receiver was still in her hand. She set it back in its cradle. She stepped away from the phone and walked quickly, not running, walking at the edge of running, and she turned 2 corners and went into a coffee shop and sat at the counter and ordered something she didn't want and stared at the laminate surface in front of her and thought with everything she had. Someone had known, not Decker. Decker was hired after the penthouse meeting 6 days ago. This was earlier than Decker. This was, she made herself say it, made herself think it fully, without softening. This was inside. Someone inside her architecture had been there from the beginning or close to it, and Marcus Hale was dead, and the domestic channel was burned, and the storage unit was compromised. and she was sitting in a coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan with one drive in her coat pocket and midnight approaching and a woman at a financial publication who was the only journalist still standing, and she did not know where the breach was. She paid for the coffee she hadn't touched and left. She went to a hotel, not one she had used before, not one with any connection to any identity she had established. A mid-range business hotel in the 50s, paid in cash, registered under a name she invented at the desk. She took the elevator to the 8th floor and found her room and locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed and opened the laptop she had been carrying in her bag. The air-gapped one, battery replaced, everything she needed on the local drive, and she began to work through the breach. The channel she had used to contact Marcus Hale was the same channel she had used for all three journalists in the initial outreach. If that channel had been surveilled before she used it, then the question was how. She had established the channel through a series of steps she had believed were clean: an anonymizing relay, a temporary email address created on a public terminal at a library in the Bronx, a messaging structure that should have been untraceable. The library terminal. She stopped. The library in the Bronx. She had used it once, in the 7th week, on a Thursday afternoon. She had gone there specifically because it was the kind of place where a woman in a coat sitting at a public terminal attracted no attention. And she had been careful. She had been careful about everything except the parking. She had driven there and parked in the garage on the adjacent block, and the garage had plate recognition cameras on entry and exit. And if anyone had been running her plates, but no one should have been running her plates in the 7th week. No one should have known to run her plates. She had not yet confronted Tae-hyun. The affair was still something she was processing privately. She had told no one what she was doing. She had told no one. She made herself go back further, all the way back. The first weeks, before the laptop, before the storage unit, before any of the architecture existed. What she had done in those early weeks was look at financial documents. She had sat in her own study on her air-gapped laptop and looked at publicly available filings and documents she had accessed through her existing professional channels. She had a still active login for a financial data aggregator she had used in her pre-marriage career, a service called VeritasNet that provided access to international corporate registry data, SEC filings, offshore entity databases. She had maintained the subscription quietly, the way she maintained the passport, against future necessity. She had used it in the 2nd week to access Monroe Atelier's Luxembourg subsidiary filings. VeritasNet logged access. That was industry standard. It logged the user, the date, the entities searched. And her login was under her professional name, her real name, her pre-marriage professional identity, Serena Cole, which was not her current legal name, but which anyone who knew her history would be able to connect to her in under an hour. If Tae-hyun had anyone monitoring her professional identity, and why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't a man who planned his own exit in careful secret also maintain surveillance on the people closest to him as a matter of routine? Then the VeritasNet access had flagged in the 2nd week. Monroe Atelier, Luxembourg subsidiary, searched by Serena Cole. She had been known for weeks before she thought she was invisible. The room felt smaller. She was aware of the walls in a way she had not been 30 seconds earlier. She made herself breathe. In through the nose, out slowly. She was not going to spiral. She was going to use this. If she had been known from the 2nd week, then the question was not how she had been found, but why she had been allowed to continue for 9 more weeks. Why hadn't Tae-hyun moved against her immediately? Why let her build the case, move the drives, establish the channels? Why? She knew why. She knew it the moment she asked the question, because he had wanted to know what she was building. He had let her build it so he could map it. Every drive she created and stored, every channel she established, every contact she made, she had been laying out the architecture for him, and Decker's job had not been to find the evidence and destroy it. Decker's job had been to wait until the map was complete enough and then move fast. The first drive was the test. If she came back to the storage unit and found it gone and didn't run, they would know the system was deeper than the one drive, which she had done. She had gone back and confirmed the drive was gone, and then she had run to the Bronx to check the 4th drive, and she had led them. Not directly, not obviously, but the act of moving in a particular direction was itself information, toward the existence of additional caches. She had walked herself into it. She sat with that for the 30 seconds she could afford to give it. Then she stood up. Midnight was 4 hours away. She needed to accelerate the release. She had built the dead man's switch to require her active intervention to prevent it. But she had also built in a manual acceleration trigger, a sequence she could execute from any internet-connected device that would collapse the release window from 8 days to 8 hours. She had built it for exactly this kind of contingency, a situation in which waiting was more dangerous than moving. She needed internet access that was not traceable back to this room or this identity. She packed everything into her bag. She wiped the room, surfaces she had touched, the bathroom, the door handle. She left the key on the bed and took the stairs and exited through the side door onto the cross street. She walked 3 blocks and found a 24-hour copy center and paid cash for 30 minutes of computer time and sat at a terminal with her back to the wall and her bag in her lap, and she accessed the server through the proxy chain with hands that were moving faster than she had ever moved them. The chain was intact. The server was active. The automated release was still armed and running, counting down from the original trigger date. She navigated to the acceleration sequence and she stopped, hands over the keyboard, and she thought for exactly 10 seconds about what executing this meant. It meant she had 8 hours. In 8 hours, coordinated evidence packages would arrive at 12 simultaneous destinations. The financial publication, the Brussels contact, every major international law enforcement task force she had identified with jurisdiction over elements of the empire, 3 anti-organized crime bodies, 2 financial intelligence units. All of it, everything she had built, released in 8 hours regardless of what happened to her, regardless of what Decker found, regardless of what Tai Hyun did between now and then. It also meant that if she had miscalculated anything, if any package was compromised, any recipient was bought, any evidence chain was defective, she would not have time to correct it. She executed the sequence. The confirmation appeared on the screen. Release window modified. 8 a.m. Eastern. Countdown active. She cleared the browser history, logged out, wiped the keyboard with her sleeve, and left. She was on the sidewalk for 11 minutes before the black SUV found her. She saw it first as a reflection in a shop window, a dark shape moving at the wrong speed, too slow for traffic, the specific slow of a vehicle tracking a pedestrian. And she turned into the next block and lengthened her stride without breaking into a run, because running was information and she was not giving anything else away. She turned again, took a service entrance between 2 buildings, cut through a passage she had noticed 2 days ago when she had been in this neighborhood for an entirely different reason. She had been cataloging exits for weeks without knowing she was doing it. The habit of preparation, the deep instinct inventory of a woman who had understood on some level for much longer than 11 weeks that a day like today was coming. The passage opened onto a parallel street. She came out moving fast, and she was on the cross street before the SUV could have turned, and she did not look back. She was breathing hard. She registered this, the body's honest accounting, the heart rate, the shallowness of breath, the way her legs felt slightly wrong, slightly too present, the specific physical sensation of acute fear that the brain produces when it understands the situation more clearly than it is willing to articulate consciously. She kept moving. Her phone, the burner, reconstructed, buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it without slowing and looked at the screen. A text from the number she now associated with Decker. You just executed an early release trigger. We saw the server access. You have until 8 a.m. So do we. She put the phone back in her pocket. He was right. They had 8 hours now, and so did she. And the question was whether the evidence packages could survive 8 hours of aggressive interference with their delivery mechanisms, and she was almost certain they could. She had stress-tested the delivery architecture specifically against interference, but almost certain was the phrase she kept returning to, and she did not like it. She needed to get to somewhere defensible. Not physically. She was not equipped for a physical confrontation, and had no illusions about that. Defensible in terms of visibility. Public, documented, surrounded by people who would notice and record what happened to her. Because the most important thing she could be, for the next 8 hours, was alive and visible, since her continued existence was still the only thing preventing anyone from credibly claiming the automated release was fabricated or coerced. She needed to be somewhere that Decker could not move against her without creating the exact kind of documentation trail that would make everything worse for Tae Hyun. She thought about where that was. She was 4 blocks from the Meridian building, the building that housed, on the 32nd floor, the headquarters of Kang Capital International. The legitimate empire. The frame. The place where Halverson, the CFO with the nervous eyes, had an office. She walked toward it. The lobby security recognized her. This was the calculation. She had been here dozens of times over 9 years, the wife of the chairman, known by name to the desk staff. And it was 6:58 in the evening on a Friday, and the building was not empty. There were still people. There were still cameras everywhere. There was still a lobby guard who had shaken her hand at the company Christmas party 2 years running, Mrs. Kang. The guard, young man, name badge reading Torres, straightened. "Is Mr. Kang expecting you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Halverson," she said. "Is he in?" Torres checked the system. "He's still logged in upstairs. Should I call ahead? Please?" She stood in the lobby while Torres called. Her reflection in the polished floor was a woman in a gray coat who looked composed and purposeful and who was running on 3 hours of sleep and the metabolic aftermath of sustained acute fear and who had 8 hours left and one drive in her pocket and an automated release that was now irrevocable. She looked at her reflection. She squared her shoulders. Torres said, "He says to go up. 32. She took the elevator. She watched the floor numbers climb. She thought about Halverson, the CFO, with the fiduciary responsibility he had been carrying like something too heavy to put down. And she thought about what she needed from him and what she could offer him and whether, when it came to it, he would make the right choice. The elevator opened onto the 32nd floor. The offices were in the wind-down state of late Friday, half the lights on, the assistants gone, a quiet that was both normal and, tonight, felt like the quiet before weather. Halverson was standing in his doorway at the end of the hall. He was still in his work clothes, jacket off, sleeves rolled. He looked like a man who had been sitting with something difficult for a while and was tired of sitting with it alone. "Mrs. Kang," he said. "Serena," she said. "Please." She walked toward him. When she reached the doorway, she looked at him directly. "I need 15 minutes, and I need you to listen." He stood aside. She went in. He closed the door. The office had a view of the city. She did not look at it. She set her bag down and she turned to face him and she said, "I know you found the Luxembourg irregularity. I know you flagged it internally and nothing happened. I know you've been sitting on that for how long? 2 months? 3? His jaw moved. 6 weeks. 6 weeks, she said. "Okay, I need you to make a call tonight, right now. Not tomorrow, not Monday, tonight. I need you to call your contact at the SEC, and I need you to tell him what you found, and I need it on record before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." "That's an extraordinary—" "Halverson." She put her hands flat on his desk. Her voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud, but it was the kind of quiet that carried weight because everything unnecessary had been stripped out of it. "Tomorrow morning, the federal investigation into this enterprise begins. It begins whether you make this call or not. The difference is whether you're on record as the CFO who flagged the irregularity through proper channels 6 weeks ago, or whether you're the CFO who sat on it while everything collapsed." She held his gaze. "I need you to understand which of those positions you want to be in." He was very still. "What investigation?" he said carefully. "The one that starts at 8 a.m., she said. The silence in the office stretched for a long moment. Outside the window, the city was a grid of light, indifferent and permanent, moving at its own speed the way it always did regardless of what was happening in the rooms above it. Halverson moved to his desk. He sat down. He opened his drawer and took out a leather folder and held it without opening it. His hands were not entirely steady. "The irregularity I found," he said. "It connects to entities in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. I documented it." He set the folder on the desk. "I've had it in this drawer for 6 weeks because I didn't know who to trust." "You can trust the SEC contact," she said. "You've worked with them before on compliance matters. That relationship is clean." She paused. "Make the call." His hand moved toward the phone. It rang before he could pick it up. They both looked at it. The display showed an internal number, not an outside line, an internal extension. One of the few that would still be active at this hour. Halverson frowned. He picked it up. He listened for 5 seconds, then his face changed. He set the phone down slowly, and he looked at Serena across the desk, and his expression was the expression of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath him has shifted in every direction simultaneously. "That was building security," he said. "Mr. Kang is in the lobby. He's coming up." The elevator was already moving. She could not hear it, but she knew it was. She looked at the closed office door and then at the window and then at Halverson, and she made, in the space of a single breath, the calculation she had been building toward. The calculation took 1 breath. Serena picked up her bag. She looked at Halverson and she said very quietly, "Make the call before he reaches this floor. Do not wait. Do not open that door for anyone until you have made the call. She paused. Your name on the right side of this is the only thing that protects you. You have about 90 seconds. She went to the window. The office was on the 32nd floor and the window did not open, which she had already understood, which was why she was not looking at the window as an exit. She was looking at what was reflected in it. The office door, the hallway beyond the frosted glass panel beside it, the elevator indicator on the far wall of the corridor. The number climbing. 26, 27. She turned back to Halverson. He had the phone in his hand. He was looking at her with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he had been standing at the edge of for 6 weeks and had finally run out of reasons not to jump. Call, she said. He dialed. She moved to the side of the door. Not behind it, beside it, pressed against the wall in the narrow space between the door frame and the bookcase, in the angle that would be invisible for the first 2 seconds after the door opened from the outside. She controlled her breathing, in through the nose, out slowly. Her heart was doing what hearts did in situations like this, a rapid, insistent percussion she could feel in her throat and her wrists. And she acknowledged it the way she acknowledged everything now, from the clinical remove that had become her primary mode of existence, and she stood very still. She heard Halverson say, into the phone, "This is Richard Halverson, CFO of Kang Capital International. I need to speak with someone in enforcement. Tonight. I have documented evidence of financial irregularities in our Luxembourg subsidiary structure that I believe constitutes securities fraud and potential money laundering, and I am prepared to provide full cooperation." A pause. "Yes, tonight. I'll hold." 30 seconds later, the elevator opened. She heard footsteps in the corridor. More than one set. Tae-hyun did not go places alone. He had not gone places alone in years, and the men he kept close were chosen for specific capabilities that had nothing to do with business acumen. She counted the footsteps. 2, maybe 3 additional people beyond Tae-hyun himself. The frosted glass panel beside the door darkened as shapes moved past it in the hallway. Slowed, stopped, the door handle moved. Halverson, to his credit, did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the desk and his voice on the phone, and he said, "Yes, I'm still here. I have documentation. I can be at your offices within the hour." The door opened. Tae-hyun walked in. He was alone. That was the first thing she registered. The other footsteps had stayed in the corridor. The door had opened for one person, and Tae-hyun came into the office and stopped when he saw Halverson on the phone, and his eyes moved through the room with the rapid inventory she recognized and found her, pressed against the wall in the angle beside the bookcase, and the two of them looked at each other across the length of the office. His face did not produce the expression she had been braced for. There was no rage in it, no cold command, none of the authority performance she had seen him deploy in rooms like this for 9 years. What was in his face was something she had not seen before in all those years, something that was past calculation and past performance, something that had the quality of a man looking at the final version of something he had known was coming for a long time. He looked exhausted, not physically. Exhausted in a way that was older and deeper than physical. He said, "How long have you known what I am?" The question surprised her. Not its content, the content she had been living with for 11 weeks, but its register. It was not a challenge. It was not tactical. It was the question you asked when you had stopped trying to win and wanted instead to understand. She came away from the wall. She stood in the middle of the office, her bag on her shoulder, 5 feet from him. Halverson was still on the phone, his voice low and steady, and neither of them looked at him. "Which part?" she said. "All of it." She thought about the honest answer. She had not permitted herself to think about the honest answer in 11 weeks, because the honest answer required her to look at herself in a way that was incompatible with the discipline she needed. But they were here now, at the end of it, in an office on the 32nd floor with the city outside, and Halverson on the phone, and 7 hours and 40 minutes left on the release countdown, and she looked at him and she gave him the honest answer. "I knew something was wrong before I knew what it was," she said. "I think I knew in the 3rd year. I didn't look because I didn't want to know, and then 11 weeks ago I looked." She paused. "I should have looked in the 3rd year." He absorbed this. His hands were at his sides, loose, not the hands of a man who was calculating a physical move. She had watched those hands for 9 years, and she knew the difference. "The exit plan," he said. "You were supposed to be left behind," she said. "I know. That was not—" He stopped. Something moved in his face, something complicated and insufficient. That was structural. That was never about Tae-hyun. She said his name the way he had said hers in the kitchen, just the syllables, just the sound, stripped of everything else. Don't. He was quiet. It was always about what it was, she said. You built something. I helped you frame it. I didn't look at what I was framing. That's on me. The exit plan is on you. She met his gaze. Those are both true at the same time. I've made peace with that. And the case? Released at 8 a.m. I know. He looked at her steadily. There's nothing I can do about that now. No. A long silence. Behind them, Halverson finished his call. She heard the phone settle back in its cradle. She heard Halverson stand, heard the sound of the leather folder opening, heard the deliberate movements of a man who was organizing himself for something he had been putting off for 6 weeks and was finally going to do. Tae-hyun looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, Florence? She did not react. It was in the exit accounts I set up, he said. One of the properties I was acquiring for the new identity. Florence. I don't know why I chose it. He paused. I've never been. I've been through it once, through the airport, but I've never actually been there. She said nothing. It's a good city for someone who wants to disappear, he said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. I'll be fine, she said. He nodded once, slowly. It was the nod of a man accepting a verdict that he understands he earned, and there was in it, she thought, a dignity that surprised her. Not because she had thought him incapable of it, but because she had not expected to see it here, at the end, in a borrowed office with the sound of sirens beginning somewhere far below. The SEC call had been made. Other calls would follow. The building's lobby cameras had recorded his arrival. Everything was already in motion. I'm going to turn myself in, he said. Tonight. Before the raids start. She looked at him. Cooperation was what you offered, he said. At the kitchen table. That was 8 days ago. Something moved in his expression that was almost wry, almost in a way that lived in the same neighborhood as the person she had met at a conference in Hong Kong 20 years ago. I took a while to get there. You have until 8 a.m., she said. That's 6 hours and 50 minutes. I know. He straightened his jacket. He looked around the office once, at the city through the window, at Halverson, at the leather folder on the desk. Then he looked at her one final time, and what was in his face she did not have a name for and did not try to name. Goodbye, Serena. Goodbye, she said. He walked to the door. He opened it. He walked out into the corridor, and she heard his footsteps and the footsteps of the men with him, and then the elevator, and then nothing. Halverson said quietly, I have to go downtown. I know, she said. Go. She left the building at 7:43 in the evening and walked west toward the park and sat on a bench for a long time in the November cold. The drive was in her coat pocket, and she held it through the fabric with one hand, not looking at it, just holding it. The city moved around her with the indifference that was, she had always thought, one of New York's particular qualities, its enormous capacity to contain events of tremendous weight without adjusting its surface by a single degree. She thought about Marcus Hale. She had not let herself think about Marcus Hale properly since she learned what had happened to him, because there had been no time, and because thinking about him properly required her to accept a weight that she had told herself she would carry later and later was now arriving. A man was dead. A journalist who had sat in a car outside his apartment in Brooklyn and who had run half marathons and who had received a message from a source he did not know and had died 4 days later. She had sent the message. She had not killed him. She held on to that, held it carefully because it was true. But she had set in motion the chain that had marked him, and she would carry that for a long time, possibly for the rest of her life. And she understood that carrying it was appropriate, and she did not try to negotiate it down. She thought about the Brussels journalist's daughter, a child in Ghent, who had been used as a variable in a calculation, who had no knowledge of any of it, who would wake up tomorrow and go to school and not know that her family had spent 48 hours inside a terror that was connected to a story about a woman in New York they had never met. She would carry that too. She thought about Aria Monroe. She had not thought about Aria in a while. The affair had become such a small part of what this was that it had receded almost entirely. But sitting on the bench in the November cold, she let herself think about her. The woman who had stood in a silk robe in a penthouse and had the specific alertness of someone who had just understood that they were more expendable than they knew. She had told Aria to find a different investor, which was the most inadequate advice she had ever given anyone, and which she had given anyway because it was the only honest thing to say. Aria Monroe was going to be caught in this regardless. The Monroe Atelier structure was too central to the evidence package to spare her. Whether she had known the full scope or had been, as Serena had said, a partial pawn, a jury would decide. There was nothing Serena could do about that. She had thought about it and arrived weeks ago at the conclusion that the case could not be selectively released to protect individuals who were inside the structure. The structure had to fall whole. That was its integrity. You did not get to choose which parts of the truth came out. She sat on the bench until the cold was a serious presence, until her hands were stiff and her breath was visible, and then she stood up and she walked. The release executed at 8 o'clock the following morning with the precision of a mechanism that had been built by someone who did not accept imprecision. 12 simultaneous deliveries, 12 recipients receiving, at 8 a.m. Eastern on a Saturday, a secure package containing 4,214 documents, financial records, communications transcripts, corporate registry extractions, bank transfer records, network maps, and a 47-page explanatory memorandum written in the specific language of forensic accounting, structured for maximum prosecutorial utility, with every evidence chain clearly annotated and every source document authenticated. Serena was on a train to Philadelphia when the release executed. She knew it had executed because the confirmation appeared on the air-gapped laptop, which she was running on the train with a battery she had fully charged the night before. She looked at the confirmation for a moment. Then she closed the laptop and put it in her bag and looked out the window at the industrial outskirts of New Jersey, moving past in the early gray light. She felt, she thought, not triumphant, not relieved. Something quieter than either of those. Something that had the quality of a thing that has been done and is now done, irreversible, finished, carrying forward into consequence without any further act required of her. The weight did not lift. She had not expected it to lift. She had expected exactly this flatness, this exhaustion that was different from tiredness, this specific gray light of a morning after. She watched New Jersey and she let the train carry her south. Taehyun turned himself into the FBI's New York field office at 2:17 in the morning, 4 hours and 43 minutes before the evidence package is released. His attorney, not the firm that appeared in Serena's evidence documentation, a different attorney, someone he had maintained separately, which told her something about his level of preparation that she absorbed without surprise, had negotiated the terms of the surrender in advance. He arrived with documentation. He was, his attorney stated in the official record, prepared to offer full cooperation with federal and international investigations. The morning the raids began, she was in Philadelphia. She watched the news coverage on a television in a hotel lobby, the same mid-range business hotel aesthetic as the one she had fled in New York, the same laminate surfaces and commercial carpet, and she watched the footage of synchronized federal operations across 5 states and 3 countries, the helicopters over the Hamptons estate, the black vehicles outside the Geneva villa, the images of men in expensive suits being walked through the lobbies of buildings she recognized, and she felt the distance between herself and all of it as something vast and necessary. The underbosses moved exactly as she had predicted. By the second day, 3 of Taehyun's top-tier lieutenants had retained counsel and were in preliminary cooperation discussions. By the 5th day, 2 had formally flipped. The testimony structure began to take shape, the cascade of corroborating accounts that would, over the next several months, build the prosecution's case into something that would not require Serena to appear in court at all. Her documentation was the foundation. Human testimony would be the walls. Halvorson's filing with the SEC, submitted at 10:40 p.m. on the night of the office confrontation, gave him the position he needed. A cooperating witness who had proactively reported before the investigation formally began. A man who had sat with his leather folder for 6 weeks and had finally, at the last possible moment, done the right thing. She did not begrudge him the credit. She had needed him to do it, and he had done it. Aria Monroe's attorneys issued a statement on the 4th day describing their client as a victim of criminal deception who had been unaware of the true nature of the financial structures connected to her business. Whether this was true or partly true, or the beginning of a legal strategy, Serena did not know and would not allow herself to speculate. The evidence she had provided was accurate. What a jury did with it was not her province. She watched the coverage for 3 days, and then she stopped watching. She spent 6 weeks in Philadelphia, in a furnished apartment near the university that she rented under her constructed identity, working through the legal process she had engaged in advance, a process that unfolded, for the most part, as she had planned. Her exposure was limited, as the legal consultation had confirmed it would be, to two specific advisory engagements that her attorney framed, accurately and with full documentation, as the work of a professional who had been deceived about the purpose of the structures she was consulting on. She cooperated fully. She answered every question asked of her in a deposition that lasted 11 hours across 2 days, and which required her to recount, in forensic detail, the entirety of what she had found and how she had found it. The deposition was the hardest thing she had done in the whole 11 weeks. Harder than the penthouse meeting, harder than the storage unit, harder than the bench in the November cold. Because the deposition required her to tell the truth about the second year and the third year and the years after that, about the choices she had made and the questions she had not asked, and to say those things clearly and on record. In a room with lawyers and a court reporter and fluorescent lighting that had no mercy whatsoever. She said them. She said them steadily and completely, without softening and without embellishment. And when the deposition was finished, she sat in the parking garage outside the federal building for 40 minutes before she could drive. And she let herself be whatever she was in that moment, whatever the word was for what existed in the aftermath of finally, fully, without reservation, telling the truth about your own complicity. And then she drove back to the apartment and she slept for 11 hours. She had not slept 11 consecutive hours in 4 months. The fortune question resolved itself in a way she had not entirely anticipated. The forensic accounting process attached to the criminal investigation identified and traced the assets with the thoroughness that such processes, done properly, achieved. Serena's legally held assets, the prenuptial holdings, the accounts in her name that predated the marriage, a relatively modest amount compared to the scale of what Tai-hyun had built, were confirmed as untainted. An additional settlement, awarded through a civil proceeding tied to the criminal case, added to that base. The total was considerable. It was the kind of number that resolved certain categories of future problem permanently. She transferred the entirety of it in 3 tranches to a foundation she had identified months earlier, an international organization that provided legal and financial support to witnesses, investigators, and victims of organized crime, specifically in cases where the individuals involved had been endangered by their cooperation with law enforcement. She had researched the foundation carefully. It was reputable, effective, and had, in the past 3 years, assisted the families of several journalists who had been targeted as a direct result of their investigative work. She made the transfers anonymously. She did not want credit for them. She did not want credit for any of it. Not the case, not the evidence, not the empire's collapse. She wanted the opposite of credit. She wanted the specific erasure that came from closing a chapter so completely that it could not be reopened, and the only way she knew to do that was to make sure she had given back everything she had taken from the years she had spent looking the other way. She did not know if the accounting was exact. She suspected it was not. She suspected that some debts were not the kind that could be precisely settled, that some things you carried not because you could make them balance, but because carrying them was what you owed to the people who could not carry them anymore. She accepted this. She had made peace with imperfect accounting before the train reached Philadelphia, watching New Jersey in the early gray light, and that peace had held. Yeah. She left for Florence in March, when the winter had begun to release its grip and the light was changing its character towards something softer, when the first preliminary hearings had established that the trial would proceed and that her presence would not be required. She flew under her constructed identity with a single piece of luggage, and she arrived in the early afternoon when the city was gold and ancient and entirely indifferent to her history. And she stood outside the arrivals terminal for a moment with her face in the pale spring sun. She had rented an apartment in the Oltrarno district, south of the river, in a building that was 400 years old and had seen, she thought, considerably more drama than she brought with her. The apartment had high ceilings and old plaster, and a window that looked onto a courtyard where a fig tree grew against the south wall, and where the light arrived each morning at a particular angle that she had not anticipated and which, after the first week, she found herself waking early to see. She had arranged a position at a small restoration studio, not under false pretenses exactly, but under simplified ones. She had studied art history for 2 years before switching to accounting, which nobody had ever considered relevant to anything, and which turned out, in Florence, to be a sufficient credential to sit beside a restoration conservator named Elena, who was 71 years old and had spent her career returning damaged paintings to their original states, and who regarded Serena with the direct, unimpressed appraisal of a woman who had no patience for anything that wasn't useful. "You know what you're looking at," Elena said, on the first morning, gesturing toward a 17th century panel painting laid on the work table between them, the surface obscured by discolored varnish, the underlying image almost entirely invisible. "Generally," Serena said, "generally." Elena made a sound that was not quite dismissive. "In this work, generally is useless. You see what is in front of you, or you see nothing. You cannot approach a damaged thing with a general idea of what it should look like. You must be specific, patient. You must accept that the process reveals the image on its own terms, not yours." She handed Serena a small tool. "Begin here. The edge, lightly." Serena began. She worked in that studio for 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, in the company of damaged things that were being slowly and carefully returned to what they had been before whatever had happened to them. The work required everything that financial forensics had required: patience, precision, the willingness to sit with what was unclear, and trust that clarity would emerge from process rather than force. And it required something beyond those things, something she found she had capacity for that she had not known about, a specific kind of care for the object itself, for the painting as a thing that had survived and was worth the effort of its survival. Elena said nothing about her past. Serena offered nothing about it. The women worked in the studio in a companionable quiet that deepened over weeks into something that had the quality of trust without ever having been explicitly established. And Serena understood that Elena knew, in the way that perceptive people knew things without being told, that her new assistant had arrived from somewhere difficult, and that what she needed was not questions, but work, and the daily presence of something worth restoring. She was right about that. The trial began in September. She did not watch the coverage. She received, periodically, brief communications from her attorney summarizing developments that required her awareness. There was one moment, in October, when it appeared a defense motion might require her testimony in person, and she had spent 48 hours in a specific suspension of readiness before the motion was denied. But she did not watch. She had done what she had done, and the trial was the consequence of that, and the consequence did not require her presence. Her evidence was the foundation. It would hold without her. She heard, through the same brief attorney communications, that Tae-hyun had maintained his cooperation throughout. Every week brought additional corroborating testimony, additional evidence confirmations, additional defendants whose own situations were clarified by the documents she had assembled. The prosecution case was, by every account she received, overwhelming. She had known it would be. She had built it to be. She did not allow herself to feel satisfaction about this. She felt, when she thought about it, which was less often as the months passed, as the fig tree in the courtyard dropped its leaves and the light changed again toward winter, something complicated and unresolvable, something that had components of grief and anger and responsibility and a weariness that she suspected would not fully lift for a long time. She had married a man. She had loved that man in the early years, or loved the version of him she had decided to see, which was perhaps not the same thing. That man had built something that had harmed an enormous number of people she would never meet, in places she had never been. Over years, she had spent attending galas and sitting on charity boards and helping frame a portrait of legitimacy for an empire of suffering. She carried that. She would always carry that. But she had also done the thing that was hard to do. She had looked at it, finally, without flinching, and she had done the work of documentation and evidence and process that her training and her ability uniquely equipped her to do. And she had done it alone, in fragments, at extraordinary cost, and she had done it correctly. The foundation held. The structure rose from it. The consequence was unfolding as consequence should, slowly, publicly, under legal scrutiny, in a courtroom where the evidence spoke in the language of specificity rather than accusation. She had done that. She had earned the right to that. On a Tuesday morning in November, 11 months after she had stood in a kitchen on the 53rd floor of a Manhattan tower and read a text message that wasn't meant for her eyes, Serena Ashcroft, living now under a name she had chosen for herself, a name with no history attached to it, a name that was her own in the way that only chosen things can be, carried a cup of coffee to the window of the Oltrano apartment and stood in the pale winter light looking at the fig tree in the courtyard below. The tree had lost its leaves. The branches were bare and dark against the old plaster of the south wall, and the light was low and thin. The winter light of a city that was very old and had been here through things that made her story, enormous to her, seismic in her own life, into one more small drama in a very long history of small dramas, each of which had seemed to the person inside it like the whole world, and each of which had resolved, eventually, into the past. She was not the woman who had stood in that kitchen. She understood this the way you understood a fact that was too large for emotion. Not with joy, not with grief, not with any of the clean feelings that stories were supposed to provide at their endings, but with the specific exhausted clarity of someone who has been through something real and has come out the other side not unscathed but whole, not unchanged but still standing, still capable of looking at a bare-branched fig tree in November light and finding it, against everything, worth looking at. She drank her coffee. She had work today. Elena had a new piece coming in, a small portrait from the 16th century, provenance uncertain, surface damage from water and time. They would start on it this morning, beginning at the edges, working with the patience the work required, not imposing what they thought it should look like, but following what was there, what had survived, what was asking to be seen. She set the empty cup on the windowsill. She got her coat. She went to work.